It's 1945. The war, which has raged across the world for 6 long years, is drawing to its grisly close. The next crucial few months will be mythologised and memorialised. They'll echo down the years. In this episode of the History Book Buffs, we're going to look at 2 brilliant new books that explore these myths. We're looking at 1945, The Reckoning by Phil Craig, and Victory 45 by Al Murray and James Holland. Both books look at the myths and the monsters at the end of World War II. My name's Antonia Senior, and with my colleague Roger Moorhouse, the award-winning historian, we review all the best history books, fact and fiction. So give us a like, subscribe, tell your friends, follow us. Help us bring all the best reviews of all the best books on the History Book Buffs. So, Moorhouse, welcome.
We're back again.
We're back again.
Indeed.
VE Day.
VE Day, great fun. Enjoyed that. Enjoyed the Lancaster. That was a highlight.
Yeah.
Always good to see it out and flying.
I love the fact that we're doing a VE Day recording like a week after everybody else has done their VE Day stuff. Never, unprofessional.
Never knowingly professional is the phrase that we should adopt as a motto.
It's like we saw a bandwagon, tried to jump on it.
Yeah, and realised it was a dust lorry. Yeah. Exactly.
There we bandwagon. Go. Anyway, here we are. We're going to do it anyway.
Exactly.
So 2 fantastic books. Victory 45 first. James Holland and Al Murray, obviously famed probably within the community of people listening to this as hosts of We Have Ways pod, as well as historian and comedian. A wonderful book. Basically looks at the last few weeks of the war, goes from May 45 to the surrender of Japan.
Yeah, end of April.
Yeah.
End of April.
And
very end of April, actually.
Basically looks at the defeat of the Axis powers through the prism of 8 surrenders. Yeah. 8 iconic moments of surrender. So we've got Berlin in there, we've got Rome in there, we've got the surrender of Japan in there, and I'm counting 5 more. Yeah,
there's Reims, Lüneburg, Karlshorst in Berlin, and they've got a couple of the surrender or the liberation of one particular concentration camp as well. So to add that aspect in, so it's a lovely book in that sense. It's got a really nice tight focus on its subject matter, which is that literally the last week of the war in Europe, and then it switches to Japan, and it has the circumstances of the atomic bombing of Japan, which we talked about before on the pod, and then the surrender in Japan as well. So it's got a really nice tight focus. And what they do really, really well is to bring out the sort of the human drama of it. It's written in a pretty Spartan style, but as we know they can do really, really, really well. But they pull out 2 or 3 characters, probably more than that, but throughout the book that they sort of refer back to, diarists, or there's one that I know very well from my Berlin book, Ruth Andreas Friedrich. They use for Berlin. She's a brilliant diarist. They use her for a lot of the sort of the commentary. She was involved with the resistance in Berlin, so was a great critic of the Nazis and all of that. So she's a really good voice to have. Very objective, but at the same time suffers all of the same privations that everybody else does in Berlin in those final days, and all the threat that they do from the incoming Soviets. So she's a really good voice, and others. But so that's what they do really well. It has a really nice sort of cinematic feel about it, because it is very sort of episodic. It's essentially, I'm not doing it disservice by saying it's a sort of a series of set pieces, but really, really well done and very human, with a good sort of human thread to them.
And you're obviously an expert in quite a lot of this stuff, particularly. So you wrote a brilliant book, Berlin at War, which was about the experience of being a Berliner throughout the war. So, as an example, their take on the surrender of Berlin. Just talk us through that a little bit, and how, whether it resonated for you, whether there's anything that you.
Yeah, it was very good. I mean, I wrote about it. That's going back now probably 15 plus years.
That's a lot of years.
It is a lot of years.
It's longer than the war.
I've forgotten most of it. It's absolutely. I've forgotten most of it. I mean, there's a lot of material that I used. I did a lot of interviews for that book with Berliners of that generation, and a lot of what they told me, particularly the women, and most of them were women for the obvious reason, was all about the end of the war and the arrival of the Russians and all of that you can well imagine. And it's quite harrowing stuff. And they pull up some similar material with their retelling as well.
I have to say, I mean, we have this image of VE Day, don't we? Very much in our minds of, London jubilant in the sunshine and Princess Elizabeth in mufti wandering down the street at the Strand. And, I don't know about you, but I've often kind of thought I wouldn't have liked to have lived through the war, but I would have quite liked to be at that particular party. Maybe as a wren encountering some marauding GIs. But it was an altogether different proposition being in Berlin. I mean, obviously, because they lost the war, but I mean, literally almost like the Dark Mirror. Because these women, whereas the girls in London were drinking champagne and disappearing into the bushes willingly with servicemen, also goes the kind of jolly VE mythology. These women were absolutely living in a justified fear of what was coming their way.
Yeah,
right?
they were. I mean, they weren't. As you put it, looking forward to getting cavorting with GIs. They were absolutely terrified of the arrival of the Russians.
Yeah, and justifiably. I mean,
justifiably
the Russians were given permission by Stalin, effectively. There's the famous when he was in conversation with a Yugoslav communist.
Gilas.
And he basically, Gilas was protesting against the kind of rapish behaviour of the Red Army troops as they across Europe, and Stalin basically said...
He said, what does it matter if a soldier smacks a girl's bottom? I think that was the phrase that he used. And, some trifle. I think he used the phrase "some trifle" in referring to this, and it was really a systematic mass rape, and you can see from what we saw recently in Ukraine, for example, this isn't a one-off. This is an army that has that in its locker, in its dark locker, that it can do that. I mean, to some extent, it's a corollary of warfare always, but I think, with the aggravated circumstances, particularly in the Second World War and on the Eastern Front, of it being, total war for one thing, but also being a war with a really strong racial overtone of superiority versus sort of subhuman, or the perception thereof. That when the subhumans came back, in inverted commas, they were very keen to avenge themselves on the master race, and that expressed itself to some extent, at least, in these atrocities. So, yeah, Berlin in 1945 is an absolutely brutal place to be in, as we call it, VE Day. That's the last place in the world almost that you'd want to be on that day.
It's the sort of the epicenter of the kind of the crumbling, awful dystopian mess that is Europe at the end of the war, isn't it? I mean, again, I think one of the things that maybe, the British story overlooks, and why shouldn't it? Because, we'd also been bombed and we'd also suffered, etc., etc. But my goodness, the scale of the suffering when that war came to the close is just horrifying, isn't it?
And that's actually one of the themes that comes out in the book, and that's why there are so many peace treaties and peace agreements, actually, and partial surrenders, because, of course, the Allies had stipulated that there should be an unconditional surrender, right? There was to be no separate peace. That had been agreed at Casablanca during the war. And yet the Germans were much more concerned about trying to get as many of their own troops, but also civilians, away from the arriving Soviet armies. That this is why you've got this idea that they try and, they offer the Allies sort of terms at Lüneburg and then at Reims later on, to try and effectively have a separate peace. So the Allies, of course, are quite keen to, take what they're offered to some degree, but at the same time they're beholden to their alliance and to the the idea of an unconditional surrender, imposing an unconditional surrender on the Soviets. So they're sort of caught between those two positions, and they quite want to take what's offered, but at the same time, sorry, but you have to sort of do this properly and surrender. But the overriding, from the German perspective, the overriding worry at the end of the war is that the arrival of the Red Army, which to them appeared like the end of the world. This was Armageddon, So they were trying to get as many people out of the east as possible, if not, ideally, as you see in the book. There's lots of individual German soldiers and others saying, "Okay, so we'll surrender to the west. Now, when are we going to go and fight together against the east?"
Yes, I know.
So that comes out
amazing.
as a very strong theme. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, because that was, I think, one of the key takeaways I've had from in the past reading your work, particularly, but other people too, obviously, is the sense that who won the war. The answer to that question depends on where in Europe you're standing, right? Because for an awful lot of people standing on the continent of Europe, Stalin won the war with maybe some allies who don't really matter at this point. They're irrelevant. And I think that's a really important point to remember.
And again, even the end of the war, the idea of the war coming to an end, in a sense, is also dependent on where you're standing. Because if you're in somewhere like Poland or the Baltic states, you're yes, the end of the war finishes and the fighting finishes in a large scale, but you're essentially swapping one rather wicked occupation for another one. So there's an argument to be made that, certainly in the case of Poland, for example, the war doesn't end really until 1989 with the collapse of the communist regime. So, VE Day doesn't really mean much to the eastern half of Europe, because it's just the day that they swapped one occupation for another.
And yet it means so much to the current Russian mythology, doesn't it? Because so much of the kind of Putin's whole shtick at the moment is the Great Patriotic War and the triumph of the Soviets against the fascists, and now he's trying to sort of replay that great glorious moment in completely different circumstances. It's astonishing, isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, this is all, grist to his mill, as it were, now, the victory against fascism and all of that. This is why, I mean, that is such a big cultural kind of influence and cultural meme in as it was in the Soviet Union and now in Russia, that you can see why, in a sense, the Putin regime has adopted it for its Ukraine adventure, because it sort of works, at least for the Russian people it works. It doesn't work for the outside world, because the outside world think it sounds ridiculous, talking about denazifying Ukraine. I mean, what the hell do they mean? But for the Russian people it works, and it's because of that sort of huge symbolism of the victory in 1945.
But the British have a similar kind of mythologizing, and like the Russian one, it's all with kernels of absolute truth. We were plucky, we did fight. It was an incredibly brave generation. They did incredible things, and this book really brings that out too, right? So it's not, you could go too far in the revisionist stakes. This was still, in Britain, this was an extraordinary thing, this moment, for justifiable reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair to the book, it really does bring that across, the complexity of those negotiations in the various surrenders, Italy, Lüneburg, Reims and so on. The complexity of that, the characters involved, really interesting. And they bring it across really, really well. They bring it alive really well. As I said, it's very sort of cinematic, it's very episodic. It's a perfect read.
Okay, so we approve.
Absolutely.
We give it the Victory Day thumbs up.
Indeed, we do. And the other one we were looking at today.
Yes.
Phil Craig, 1945, A Reckoning. The Reckoning.
The Reckoning, not A Reckoning. Come on.
The Reckoning. So this is a slightly sort of wider focus than Holland and Murray. What's he trying to do with that book, do you think?
So I think this is a wonderful book. I absolutely adored it. It was a gateway into thinking about the war in a different way. So he looks at it very much as a worldwide conflagration.
Which it was.
Which it
absolutely.
was.
Yeah.
He looks at it, the imperial nature of it. So, the British empire was involved in extraordinarily profound ways. And what he's looking at is the end of the war and the way that actually there were sort of small local conflicts playing out within the wider massive conflict. That then when the end of the war comes, they all kind of have to be resolved too. So, for example, what's happening with India and Indian independence, what's happening in, Indochina, where the French have obviously, been preoccupied by surrendering and everything. So, what then happens?
Busy surrendering.
What's happening in Burma, what's happening basically across Asia. And it's completely fascinating. So it takes the kind of, the focus off Europe and towards Europe's empires and their hinterlands, which were just as involved and just as crucial and important and devastating to the people involved, but often forgotten. I mean, I think partly because we have our slightly tortuous relationship with our own imperial history.
Yes, that too. And it's an interesting sort of recalibration, I think, in that respect, because like you're saying about the mythology of 45 particularly, but even the mythology, if you go back to like 1940, and it's the sort of Britain standing alone and all of that. And again, there's a kernel of truth to that. But at the same time, we still had the Poles, we still had the Empire, which had millions of troops at its potential disposal. So, how much were we actually really alone in 1940? But I think we collectively, because Britain now, since whenever it is, end of Empire and the Commonwealth and all of that, the 60s, 70s, we've sort of recalibrated and reframed our own history in a sort of post-imperial sense, which means when you project back, we tend to forget about the empire. So what Phil Craig's book is doing is reminding us of that, like you say, and saying, well, actually, it's a much bigger conflict. It's a much more complex conflict in those areas, like you say, Malaya and India and so on.
100%.
And it's a useful sort of recalibration in that sense.
It's a useful corrective, and he sort of looks at, there are sort of two, parallel myths. So one is that he sort of looks at is this kind of British idea that we were the plucky underdog. We were, the Blitz, Dunkirk, like plucky man alone. And he says, fine, but across an awful lot of the world, we were the overdog. We were the colonial bully. We were the door knocking in the middle of the night. We were locking people up at this point all over India, just as an example for, anti-imperialist behaviour. I actually once, he talks about the Andaman Islands where they had a penal colony. And I've been to that penal colony in the Andaman Islands, and you go there as a British person, it's just a little, you just spend your whole time just like quivering with embarrassment and post-colonial shame. Sorry, which are not I'm not normally subject to these things.
You're not known for post-colonial shame, I'll be honest.
Embarrassment. And yet, when you're standing in the place where the British behave quite badly, it does,
hard to avoid.
Yeah, you have moments.
Yeah, okay.
We have our moments.
Yeah.
So he's absolutely brilliant on all of that. And he does it in a similar way to James Holland and Al Murray, in that he picks a number of people and he follows them all the way through. And my absolute favourite, are you going to have to
check your pronunciation.
My pronunciation, which I'm still going to get wrong, is a guy called Kudendera Subaya Tinyaya, which is almost certainly wrong. But his nickname is Timmy, so can we just stick with that?
So General Timmy.
General Timmy, who is the first Indian officer, the only Indian officer to command a brigade in the British Indian Army during the conflict.
Because the norm was Indian soldiers with European command.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there were Indian officers, but they weren't in command. Yeah. And then after the war, he becomes actually Chief of Staff of the Independent Indian Army. So it's through people like him that we watch this unfolding. And
his counterpoint, Chandra Bose, who's a really interesting guy.
Yeah, so Chandra Bose is obviously the Indian nationalist who, like Phil Craig makes the point, like millions of people across colonial Asia, was delighted by the Japanese advances for two reasons. One, obviously, the logistical one, that it offered the promise of independence, but two, because it pricked the bubble myth that the British were kind of invincible, because the Japanese were another group of Asians who were absolutely defeating the British at every turn in Asia, and that was a kind of moral victory as well as an actual victory on the ground. Now, of course, Bose also was very friendly with the Germans, and the problem with Bose, the reason he's a contested figure now, is because he was very willing to overlook German and Japanese atrocities because, you know, his real enemy was the British.
Yeah.
And Timmy is set up in the book as a counterpoint to that view. And Timmy was an Indian nationalist. He wanted independence, but he believed that post-independence India would need an army. It would need an army that knew what it was doing. He loved the army. He loved the people in it. He took seriously his kind of oaths to that organisation, and he wanted to work within that framework towards the point where, you know, India was going it alone. And I think towards the end of the war and after, you know, no matter how much Churchill was kind of crossing his fingers behind his back when he signed the Atlantic Charter and made some kind of sweeping comments with the Americans about self-determination.
Yeah.
Despite all of that, there was by this stage a real kind of groundswell of kind of opinion that it was a matter of when, not if, really.
Yeah.
So that was Timmy, and he, you know, he fights against the Japanese, and in doing so comes up against the Indian National Army that is recruited by Bose, which is volunteers.
So they end up fighting each other, which is quite a nice image, isn't it? Yeah. And
it's absolutely extraordinary. And that kind of thing is playing out in different sorts of ways, you know, all over this region, that, you know, brother against brother in some sense, because what's the best way to work towards your future?
I mean, you can look at that in terms of, you know, both you know, our General Timmy, I won't try and pronounce his name, General Timmy and Bose, they're both hitching their wagons to whichever vehicle they think is going to deliver Indian independence. And, you know, for Timmy, it's ultimately the British, in the hope that, you know, the empire will be generous in the event of victory and grant India independence, which in the event was what happened. And then Bose is thinking, well, you know, we're going to go with the guys that are just going to smash everything up, which is the Axis, right? So in a sense, you have to see it in those terms. I mean, it's nothing necessarily evil, I suppose, about Bose. He's willing to overlook some bad stuff. But his goal is the same as the other guys.
I think the problem is Bose is willing to overlook some really bad stuff. You know, he spent a lot of time in Berlin, as you know, and there doesn't seem to be any suggestion that he was remotely troubled by what he saw going on there against the Jews. I mean, I suppose, although I think there are certain similarities in the sense that Churchill, and I want to just say I'm a big Churchill fangirl. I'm not like in your anti-Churchill, Churchill was as bad as Hitler camp. But, you know, Churchill was willing to be in bed with Stalin in order to defeat his enemy, right?
That's true.
And
Stalin was the vehicle that was going to deliver Allied victory. Right. And so he's making a compromise as well.
Yeah. But all of these points go to say that things are much more complicated than necessarily we kind of allow for when we're
in the mythology,
sort of, you know, patriotically, breastbeatingly watching the Lancasters fly overhead, which I am also doing. I'm kind of quite torn because I'm as patriotic as the next girl, and more so possibly. But you know, these things are often quite complicated, and I think both Phil Craig's book certainly brings that out. Yeah. Those nuances and complications.
And it's sort of ticklish stuff, this, and as well.
Empire.
And you know, exactly, with our sort of focus very resolutely on that subject, and very often with very polarised opinions. But he actually negotiates it all quite well, doesn't he?
Listen, I think he's brilliant on this, because I feel very strongly, like when you're reading his book, you do not feel as if he has an axe to grind in either direction. When he finds people, you know, Indians who are in favour of the empire for whatever reason, he says so. When he finds imperialists behaving badly, he says so. There is no overarching, ahistoric kind of moralising from the present about people and their motivations of the past, which is what
Good.
so much of this kind of what so much of colonial history can sometimes get mired in.
Yeah.
But he's incredibly clear-sighted about where empire was bad and it was wrong and it did terrible things. So he doesn't whitewash anything. He just doesn't preach, which is fantastic.
Yeah, very good. And it's a very certainly in a subject as with such heightened emotions as this one at present. That's a real feat to do that, I think.
Yeah, I think we should get Phil Craig to write about trans rights.
Go Phil.
Go Phil. What else?
Philippa.
Yeah. What else can we get Phil to do? I think we're going to have some...
With his judicious sort of balancing act. You can do very
exactly.
well. It's a wonderful anecdote where I remember, because my next book coming out in the autumn on the U-boat war, and Bose appears in that, bizarrely.
Yeah.
And he mentions it in the book as well, but he was actually, he's in Berlin during the war, and then he's spirited out to get to Japan, where he's supposed to sort of raise this Indian army against the British. And he's spirited out in a submarine.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful scene. It was U-180, and it's a wonderful scene in my book where he spends most of his time as him and his adjutant, or his assistant, and they spend most of the time in the captain's quarters, which is just a sort of a curtained off room in the submarine, the rest of the crews, they know they're there, and they're just described as submarine engineers, and you can see them thinking, that's not a submarine engineer. And in the end, one of the crew realises and actually spots Bose and recognise him, because he's quite distinctive. He's got these little sort of wire-rimmed glasses and so on, and recognises him from the cover of a German magazine or whatever, and he says, you're the Indian Hitler, right?
Really?
Yeah. Which and then Bose kind of owns it. He says, "Yeah, that's me. I'm not a submarine engineer. Yeah, that's me." And then after that, they were very sort of friendly. They came out and they sort of fraternised a bit, the crew and stuff. He suffered terribly with seasickness, apparently. The whole journey. It wasn't a happy journey at all. But not many of them were by that stage.
So he was horribly ill as he went between Berlin and Tokyo. Oh, boo.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's a nice little anecdote anyway. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Good.
All right, Roger. So we are also going to recommend a couple of extra books.
Yes.
So these two are fabulous.
They are, absolutely.
Massively
Highly recommended. I've got a couple. The first one I should mention is Walter Kempowski, or to do it, in German, Walter Kempowski. Slightly unnecessary. But he did. I know you know him from writing novels. Right?
Yeah, I was going to also recommend.
Which is kind of
Walter
weird.
Kempowski.
So
I can't say him.
Kempowski. Thank you very much. But it's weird that because he wrote novels. To me, he's the great sort of diary collector, if you like. He collects he collected first-hand accounts. He's dead now. Into this really useful archive up in the north of Germany, and he published a lot of these compendiums of archival entries and of diary entries and memoir entries and so on by date. So it's a really useful resource, and there's a couple of these have been translated. One of them is available for the end of the war, which is called Swan Song 45, and it's absolutely brilliant. It is just that. It's sort of a collection of diary entries, and it'll be Soviet soldiers, German soldiers, civilians, generals, cleaners. It's across the board, and it builds into a really, really, really powerful text.
Well, we should do a deal, right? Because I was going to recommend one of his fiction books because he is genuinely one of the best novelists of the 20th century. We should do a swapsy. So you have to read. I know you don't read fiction.
I think you would say he should put us on a percentage.
Yeah, you should. But no, you're going to have to read his book, All for Nothing, which is one of the best books you will ever read. It is set in 1945 in the east of Germany, and it's a wealthy Prussian family who live in this crumbling manor house, and they're basically having to make the decision, what do they do? Because they know the Russians are coming. If they leave, they're leaving behind everything they know.
Yeah.
And what's so brilliant about it is the characters behave so humanly, so utterly recognisably, and so they kind of dither, they're bewildered, they've got their head in the sand. They don't want to act. They're just they're just utterly devastated by the fact that history has found them. This thing that we all felt during COVID. God, when we suddenly realised that we were living through history, and we were like, oh, I prefer reading about it. I don't want to do it.
Not living in history.
Yeah, so it's brilliant. So you should read it.
I will. But the interesting thing is that he wouldn't have had to work too hard to get that sort of material, to get the copy, in a sense, in his head, because he would have had it all from his diary
It's
collecting.
almost as if historical novelists actually do some research.
I know.
Who knew?
Crazy idea, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
We're going to have words.
So Kempowski, really good.
Brilliant.
For both non-fiction and fiction. And then my second one was Yelena Zhevskaya, who Al Murray and James Holland do quote quite extensively, under her real name, which was Yelena Kagan. And she wrote a memoir at the end of long after the war, called The Memoir of a Soviet Interpreter. She was just that. She was an interpreter with the Red Army. She went into Berlin at the end of the war, and she was collared by SMERSH, which was the intelligence service of became the KGB, and she was attached to the group of SMERSH agents, operatives, who were trying to ascertain what had happened to Hitler. So they sort of comb Berlin. They find Hitler's remains in the Reichschancellery garden, for example. They comb Berlin for anyone that survived, that sort of saw him in the bunker, anyone that saw him, saw his body being burnt, for example. They had worked really hard to identify the body using dental records. So they found Hitler's dentist's assistant, who was called Kette Häusermann, I think it was. She was in Berlin still, and they found her, and they got to sketch Hitler's teeth and things like this. And this is how they identified Hitler. And weirdly, she was given fragments of Hitler's jaw, including his teeth, in a little jewellery box, which she had to carry around, because it was like this is like the crown jewels that proved that Hitler had died in Berlin in 1945. And they were given to her, and she carried them around, and ultimately they ended up in Moscow. And it's a really good memoir. Came out in a translation a few years ago. Really good job. So Yelena Zhevskaya.
And yet, still, conspiracists think he's alive and living in Argentina. Is this because they don't trust the Soviet records? I mean, because the Soviets had form for lying about stuff during the war. So
yeah, okay. That's the interesting point here, is that the Soviets pivoted from, on the one hand, working really hard to identify that Hitler had indeed died in Berlin in 1945, and going to great lengths to do that, and being very systematic and scientific about it. And then the needs of propaganda meant that they then pivot to basically saying, we don't know where Hitler is, he's escaped, and it must be your fault. So it's like one of the first blasts of the Cold War, is the Soviets point the finger at the West and say, you must have helped him escape. Where is he? What have you done with him? Is he in Argentina? All this sort of thing. So they although they have the proof in their own hands, they're using the possibility of his escape as a stick with which to beat the West. And that's where the mythology comes from, that we still see coming out now, that he escaped to Argentina and all this, but it's nonsense.
Sorry, where are Hitler's teeth now?
Supposedly they're in a thing called the Trophy Archive in Moscow that no one's allowed to see. Putin has the key.
Do you think he goes in there and just strokes the little box?
I hope so. I'd be really disappointed if he doesn't.
Nice. Okay, so my book, which is our last book that we're going to talk about, is the anonymous book, A Woman in Berlin.
Fabulous.
Which actually I think you put me onto.
Yeah.
So this is an 8-week diary kept by a woman at the end of the war. And there is some suggestion it could be fictionalised, some suggestion, but
Well, it was originally anonymous, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But then the identity of the author kind of emerged, I think, much later.
Yeah. I mean, in one sense, it doesn't matter. It's because she obviously knows what she's talking about,
true.
right?
Yeah.
And it's absolutely brilliant. It's just a day-by-day account of hunger and fear, and then knowing the Red Army's coming, but also incredible resilience and incredible sorts of... one of the things that's so interesting about it is the way that you the human ability to make the extraordinary become ordinary or commonplace.
Yeah.
and it speaks to what we were talking about earlier, is that Berliner terror of the Red Army, and she makes it very clear, like, you know, that where they are, they're like, you know, all they can talk about in the last days of the war is, will the Allies get there first or will the Soviets get there first? And they are so desperate for it to be the Allies. Yeah. And it's all quite heartbreaking.
And she's very tactical about how would we put this gently? I suppose using her sexuality in a way to ensure her survival.
Yeah.
You could, if you're being brutal, you could say it's a form of prostitution, but she's using that. She's sort of trading her sexuality for safety. So she sort of works her way up the officer ranks to find someone who ultimately can protect her from everyone else below.
I read Giles Milton's brilliant book about this a couple of years ago, Checkmate in Berlin, about Berlin at the end of the war, and you've written about this as well. You know, it wasn't just the Soviets behaving badly in Berlin.
No, true.
I mean, you know, the Allies weren't quite as bad, but, you know, this was still a situation where, you know, every German woman of a certain age was engaged in some sort of bargaining around her sexuality. No, sometimes there's
not much.
When is it forced and when is it? Yeah, 100%.
In many cases, there's no bargaining going on.
Okay,
so,
obviously,
you know,
but what I mean
but she
is,
manages. The point is, she manages to use it as a bargaining chip.
Yeah.
And quite effectively.
But if you're, you know, an Allied officer who's got a German mistress at this stage of the war and you're paying her in tins of spam, you don't have much more morality than a marauding Soviet, you know, rapist. It's my contention. But, you know.
Interesting. Interesting what spam can do to a woman's passions.
I mean, I would make such.
I think we should
probably draw a veil about what I would do for a tin of spam. Let's stop.
Yeah, let's not go there. Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks, Roger.
On that bombshell, we should probably leave this particular episode.
We should.
But some really good books there, and these are two main reviews. Phil Craig's 1945, The Reckoning, and James Holland, Al Murray's Victory 45, both highly recommended, and, you know, perfect holiday reads for the summer.
Yeah, light, frothy stuff.
Exactly. Lovely.
Cheers, Roger.
See you next time.